happy to be here.
Jessica, as you probably already know, is an editor at The New Yorker. I'm proud to say that I do subscribe to The New Yorker. One
Thank
of
you.
our artists, Caitlin Cass, who has an exhibit right now at the Birchfield, is one of the cartoonists for The New Yorker. So we feel really close to that magazine here in Buffalo. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Book Forum, The Believer, and many, many other publications. Although originally from Buffalo, Jessica now lives in Flatbush, Brooklyn with her family. So again, welcome, Jessica. We're thrilled that you're here.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Before we begin, I'd like to just start by asking you a few kind of personal questions so people get to know you a little bit better. I'm wondering what part of New York, Western New York, you grew up in.
I am a product of Williamsville and the Williamsville Central School District. I was born at Children's Hospital and I went to Maple East and then Mill, Casey, and I graduated from Williamsville East High School in 1995. So born and raised all the way in Buffalo.
And when you were in Buffalo and Williamsville, I'm from Williamsville as well, did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
You know, I was always a big reader. I was always kind of buried in books. I think for a long time, I imagined that I would be a doctor writer. I was exposed to William Carlos Williams, as every middle school student in Williamsville is, but also to his biography, and I was intrigued by the idea of a doctor writer. I didn't know about Chekhov at that point. But my first semester in college, I got a C in what would have been my first pre-med course, and I thought, okay, I'm not cut out for this. But yeah, I think that I knew, straight out of the gate that I wanted to do something that worked with words. Yeah.
And where did you go to college? And we know you started. Where was it that you took that pre-med class?
I went to
Got
Yale.
that C? To Yale, right off. Well, we could forgive that C then. So how did you make your way? And did you graduated from Yale? And did you go on to graduate school?
I went to graduate school in London for a few years, and when I came back to New York, I had a succession of publishing jobs. I was an editor at the Oprah magazine. That was like my first magazine job, and I worked at Time magazine for a while. I was the culture editor there. I was at Slate for a while, and then I landed at the New Yorker just short of 4 years ago. I've been an editor there since then.
Okay, and would you be kind enough to share a little bit about what an editor at a major magazine does on a day-to-day basis?
Most, not all, but most of the work that I do at the New Yorker is for our website. And it's a mix of going to meetings and talking to writers on the phone, talking to editors about assignments they have coming up and stories that they're trying to shape. A lot of it is just trying to read everything and being really up on the news and on culture and on, what are the ideas and the stories that matter the most and how can we cover them at the New Yorker. So a lot of it is just being aware of the world around you, as well as being aware of what your colleagues are doing and how to keep everything on track. One of my favorite parts of the job is just being deep in a manuscript and trying to figure out how to get it where it needs to be. I suppose that's sort of a cousin of writing your own stuff, but it's easier to be an editor because a writer has already done all the hard work for you. And then, you have to just get it to the finish line.
And so you have an editor, no doubt, in these two novels.
My editor is Sarah Stein at Harper, and she is wonderful. I don't know if she's here tonight, but I love Sarah with all of my heart.
Well, thank you. So as we know, not too many people may have read it because the book was just released, but we'd love for you to introduce your book to us.
Sure. So the fourth child, I would say, is a love story between a mother and her two very different daughters. The mother is named Jane, and she becomes a wife and a mother as a teenager and has three children by her early 20s. And as her children are sort of, reaching late childhood and getting closer to adolescence, Jane starts feeling restless. She's devoutly Catholic, and she's devoutly bookish in her way. She's a scholarly person, but she forfeited the chance to go to college and really foster her own intellectual development and her creativity. And I think she's starting to feel the lack of that. Eventually, due to this restlessness, she makes two pivotal decisions. One is that she becomes involved in a pro-life organization that is preparing for what became known as the Spring of Life protests in 1992. And some people here with us tonight might remember those protests, which were quite big and made national news. The other pivotal decision that she makes is she adopts a child from Romania, from the Romanian orphanages, named Mirella. And Mirella has a lot of challenges, as any child who grew up in those circumstances would. These are decisions that are well-meaning, but they're also destabilizing to her family. And they're particularly destabilizing to Jane's daughter, Lauren, who as a young teenager is also coming into her own. She's discovering her own creativity, her sexuality. And I think the central tension, or a central tension of the book, is that Jane and Lauren are both reaching these inflection points, these turning points in their lives at the same time. That's the gist of it, I would say.
I'm going to just turn back to Michaela for a moment. As I mentioned to both Jessica and Michaela, I couldn't find my notes before we began, and so I'm a little out of order here. But if Michaela, would you be kind enough to just explain how the mechanics of tonight will work?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of us are familiar by now with Zoom, but of course, as always with these webinars, please use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen to ask questions to Jessica, and then during the night, I will ask those to Jessica on your behalf. So use the Q&A, and then there's a chat function too, so you can talk amongst everybody else in the Zoom. And then of course we are recording this, so if for any reason we can't make it tonight or can't watch the entire thing, this will be recorded. So.
Thank you, Michaela. And excuse me, Jessica, I'm going to turn it back to you. And I know you said you would like to read a little bit for us. I don't know if you're ready to do that, or
Yeah, I'd be happy to
proceed. Okay, great.
Definitely.
Thank you.
I'm going to read just from the very beginning of the book, so no introduction necessary. The first section of the book is just called Jane. She didn't trust easy. As she tried to account for the substance of her life and of the lives of other people she picked up along the way, other people she made, she might start there. Anything that's easy isn't worth doing, her father used to say, and her brothers would snort and snicker. Jane used to think they were laughing only at their father, always aboard his creaky carousel of platitudes. Later, she knew they were also laughing at the shape anything took on in their minds, the mute curves of a compliant girl, a girl who might be easy, a thing who might be worth doing. This girl had a discernible figure, or pieces of one, but not a face. Jane earned $3 per hour to put the Vine kids to bed and stay in their house until Dr. and Mrs. Vine returned from their Saturday night bridge game at 2 or 3 in the morning. Dr. Vine was an emergency room physician in a perpetual state of convivial jet lag. Mrs. Vine read novels and took naps and crafted delicate silver jewelry in their basement. The Vines were lean and tawny, with matching chestnut hair. Each stood the same height as the other in their stocking feet. They spoke in low, murmuring tones and touched each other frequently, and were the first adults Jane ever imagined having sex. On Saturdays, sleepy and elated with drink, they wandered into their own living room, fly-spotted skylight, floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves, cherry shag carpet that they never vacuumed, to the sight of Jane awake on their harvest gold sofa, back straight, eyes red and round, a book to her face, a ghost in their house, swaying like a naked bulb. The Vines bookshelves provided Jane with the tools of maintaining a silent yet bustling vigilance into the night. Guided by the photographs in a biography of Martha Graham, Jane choreographed tiptoeing dance routines, unidentified grit from the cherry shag accumulating on the balls of her feet. She stood at the older Vine girl's easel, gripping the crayon that mapped out the constellation of radial lines from the cover of Be Here Now. She willed herself not to check the cuckoo clock above the fireplace. And when her resolve disintegrated and she finally looked over to see 1:49 a.m., she took a book that felt to her forbidden, a Bukowski, an Aeneas Nin, a Helter Skelter, turned to page 149, read that page aloud to herself in a fierce whisper, then attempted to walk across the first floor of the Vines house, northeast to southwest corner, in exactly 149 steps. She trusted hard. Staying awake was hard. So she did it. She trusted it, Saturday night after Saturday night. One of these nights, exiting Dr. Vine's car as it idled in her family's driveway, her bones and muscles liquefying under the pressure of sleep deprivation and delta of Venus, Jane slung her hips from side to side as she approached her front stoop. She didn't know why she did it, and she was too tired even to relish the gratification of giving herself over to something perverse. Slinging her hips felt compelled, as compulsive as any of the games she'd played with numbers and words for the previous 6 hours. She didn't know if Dr. Vine was watching from the car in the driveway. She didn't know what shape she took in his mind. What kind of anything was she? Jane awoke a few hours later, Sunday, sweaty and jittery with shame and fatigue, a clammy heat inside her head, her brain rolled up in the Vine's dirty rug. In springtime, her father and brothers used to skip mass for baseball practice, and in other seasons they skipped mass for football practice or hockey practice or to get a beef on weck at Anderson's frozen custard. For Jane, there was no getting out of church. God will see you, their mother said, a warning. And it was tacitly understood that God on a Sunday would see her brothers at the batting cages differently than he would see Jane in bed with a fever or vomiting into the bayberry outside the back entrance of St. Benedict's. Jane's hair was in a ponytail, leaving both hands free to hold the flappy collar of her sailor blouse flat against her chest. Returning inside the church, she paused to dip her hand in the holy water. St. Benedict's was a bizarre sandstone fortress, no spire, no belfry, no front-facing windows, but it was the church closest to home. Today was April 29th, feast day of St. Catherine of Siena. Jane opened the photocopied pamphlet tucked inside the Sunday missals that summarized Catherine's life. As a toddler, Catherine babbled to angels. At 6, she saw Jesus. At 7, his apostles. She swore off marriage and children, and when her parents urged her to marry, she protested, cutting off her hair, willing her skin to erupt in a hideous rash, fasting. Her parents relented on the marriage. Her hair grew back. The rash faded. But Catherine's fasting became a routine or a pledge, an act of solidarity with the poor. She aspired to survive solely on the wafer and the sip of wine at daily mass. The pamphlet had an epigraph, a quotation from Catherine. It read, "Build a cell inside your mind from which you can never flee." The edges of the pamphlet were wilting between Jane's fingers. Her eyes were gritty and sore. Her mother nudged her to fall in with the voices surrounding them. Jane's lips parted, but the words didn't come. Build a cell inside your mind from which you can never flee? Jane knew she had shamed herself the night before, sauntering away from Dr. Vine, because her mind had slipped outside of its cell and her body had swung free of her mind. Fatigue was no excuse. Fatigue was to be trusted, not blamed. An underoccupied mind, a mind not pushed to its outer limits, was dangerous, its contents jostling around, causing contusions and swelling. The cell of the mind needed either to be completely full or completely empty, packed tight with problems to be solved or blown out, scalded bare. All Jane needed to keep her mind quiet was to know there was no end in sight, no end to hunger, fatigue, kneeling, crossing, no end to the nights at the Vines. The end was the void, terrifying and purposeless. Behind the altar at St. Benedict's, 30 feet high and 15 feet across, hung a crude wooden bas-relief of Christ on the cross, jagged mourners piled at his feet like kindling. So much of church was staring at a broken and bleeding man as he dies in real time, week after week, right in front of you. Nobody doing anything about it. Jane didn't know how Jesus had died exactly, of suffocation or exposure or blood loss or what, and she wanted to ask her mother, but she suspected that the question would anger her. She felt the boundaries between herself and the world dissolving. Perhaps Catherine had felt the same. The church's overhead lights sparking and shorting behind Jane's own eyes. Her dumb wooden hands grafting themselves onto the pews, hardening painfully into the knots and nodules of tree trunks. Her wooden head pitching forward, whirling with hunger, diving for sleep, the weight of it becoming Christ's body atop her own, pinned beneath him on the cross. Jane, her mother whispered through clenched teeth, the voice she would use if Jane ever asked her how exactly Jesus died. What is wrong with you? And Jane smiled because she knew the answer. That's it.
Thank you. So we don't have a lot of questions and answers tonight, and I'm hoping that you'd be kind enough to talk about the book in regards to why you wrote it, what it means to you, the overarching themes, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So I think for many years, I wanted to write about the Spring of Life, which was an event that really shook our city, really shook our hometown. That cast national attention on our hometown in a way that was relatively rare. You know, I would say that the bookending events of my life, my late childhood and adolescence, in regard to Buffalo, were on one end the Spring of Life in 1992, and on the other the murder of Burnett Slepian in 1998. Dr. Slepian was an OBGYN who was an abortion provider and who was targeted by the anti-abortion extremist movement. These were events that really stayed with me, as they did so many people in Buffalo and beyond. And I wanted to reckon with those events in terms of how they intersected with my own upbringing in the Catholic Church and the teachings of the church and the church's involvement in the Spring of Life. And I also, you know, I wanted to write a book about bodily autonomy and consent and adolescence and so many big themes that I've been wrestling with and that a lot of people wrestle with their whole lives. And it felt to me like the Spring of Life and that era in Buffalo was a good starting point for tackling that.
Well, you certainly did that. I'd like to talk a little bit, if you would, about the characters themselves, and you've limited it to the women, pretty much. We don't know the men. We don't ever get to know the men too well, other than, as the New York Times article stated, the husband was a jerk. But why did you limit it solely to the female? The mother's in there, Joan is in there, her mother, her daughters, etc. I think the Time article actually said the brothers are interchangeable, and they really were.
Yes, the New York Times article did, the New York Times review did say that. And, you know, I guess there's two things going on. I thought of the brothers in the book largely as comic relief. You know, this novel goes to some pretty intense places. It goes to places that are, it's just hard for any person to get through those experiences, and it's hard to write about them. And I wanted there to be a kind of release valve at times in the book, whether it's just listening to a song on the radio or describing a work of art, or in the case of Lauren's little brothers, just these rambunctious, crazy, ridiculous kids that are just wrestling and, you know, launching loogies and blowing farts into each other's elbows. Like I just felt like the reader needed that, and I needed that in terms of writing the book. And they are flat characters, you know, but they're intentionally flat. You know, they serve the book's purposes. They serve the larger purpose of the book in terms of its modulation and its pacing and, you know, how much intense stuff it's asking of the reader at any given moment.
You seem to also address hypocrisy throughout the book, but clearly at the very end. And I'm just wondering why and what that means to you. And was I correct to have gleaned that as an overarching theme there?
I think anything anything that the reader takes away from the book is totally valid. You know, the book doesn't really belong to me anymore. It belongs to you, and it belongs to the people at this event, and it belongs to anyone who reads it. Speaking for myself, I would say that I wasn't necessarily interested in exposing any kind of hypocrisy. I think I was interested in something closely adjacent to hypocrisy, which is just the everyday conflicts and contradictions of just being a person in the world, getting through their day. Where on the one hand, you want to hold yourself to high standards of ethics and morality. You hold yourself to a high standard as a human being. And on the other hand, the hundreds of choices that you're faced with every day that come into conflict with your morals or your ethics. That can be going to a grocery store, you know, the choices you make at a grocery store. That can be, you know, getting into your car and filling up the gas tank. There's any number of things that we do every single day, whether it's for ourselves or on behalf of our family or on behalf of our community, where there are conflicting, competing impulses, you know, where something can be good for one person and bad for another, or good for one person and bad for your moral precepts. You know, life is messier than our moral precepts. I wanted to write a book about that because I think it's a universal phenomenon that anyone can relate to. And it seemed richer, it seemed emotionally and intellectually richer than just pointing out the hypocrisy of any given political sect.
Well, that was much better said than I was able to say it. But I like the idea that the book now belongs to the reader. And we feel that way about works of art too, that once they're up on the wall, the interpretation belongs to the person who is doing the interpreting. So I think those were very difficult themes. And I think the characters, for me at least, were a little bit difficult to love. I wanted to push them in a slightly different way than they were going. Maybe I wanted them, one was a little too kind, one was not kind enough. I just had a little bit trouble with how complex and difficult the characters were. And it was almost like you wanted them to say, or I wanted to say, you really love each other. How can you find a path to express that? So what are your thoughts about that?
This is music to my ears. Like I'm really happy that you're describing the characters that way, because that means that the characters were real to you. That they were three-dimensional and that they were frustrating and disappointing and lovable, perhaps, in the ways that real people in our lives are frustrating and disappointing and maybe just short of lovable at times. You know, I think if the characters weren't to some degree falling short of expectations, then perhaps we would be lacking conflict or lacking suspense or something. I mean, that's not to say that you can't write a book with 100% likable characters who make great choices and that you're really happy for, you know, the path that their life takes. But this book wasn't going to be able to explore the themes and the ideas and the conflicts that I was interested in if the characters weren't sometimes behaving in ways that we might disapprove of or we might disagree with. But what I'm hearing is that they were real to you, and that's that is a happy event for me. So thank you.
They were very real. And I like it, and I don't want to give anything away because I know people will be reading, but Lauren did, in regards to her younger sister, the fourth child, there was a point, and it was a real turning point for everybody. Everything pivoted around that one moment. But when she came to her sister's aid, and in that same way, she came to her mother's aid at that very same point, and through the fence. And I won't give it away.
No, I mean, the people in this book love each other desperately, and I really tried to show that, and I tried not to be afraid of edging towards sentimentality at times. You know, this is a book where people tell each other that they love each other. Maybe not the right moment. You know, this is a book where, you know, people will hug and people will show affection to each other, maybe not at the right moments. You know, I'm glad that that came across, that the people in this book are failing each other, but their love for each other is never in doubt.
We have a couple questions from the participants. The first is from Ian. He says, who would play Jane in the movie of the book?
What a great question.
Who asked that question?
Ian
Ian.
Fletcher.
We need someone in their early 30s. I don't know, Rachel McAdams?
Very young.
Okay.
You know, you would need someone like smart and vulnerable and kind of capable of a like wiry, slightly high-strung energy, I think. And that the first person who comes to mind is Rachel McAdams, but I might have some esprit d'escalier about this, and like, you know, tomorrow morning taking my kids to school, I'll be like, no, it should have been, but that's the first person who comes to mind.
And then we have one more from Christopher. He wants, he says, can you talk about your process of writing the novel? What about its evolution surprised you?
Let's see. So I always had the milestones, the guideposts down. And both of my books actually followed the same path. I wrote the last scene first. I wrote the first scene second. And then right in the middle, there's a long conversation between two people. And I wrote that third. So like I had my South Pole and my North Pole and my equator. And then I could just like draw the rest of the map around it. I've always been like, even with term papers, I was like that. Like in college, I would write the conclusion first. When I used to write poetry, I would write the last line first. I just always have to know where I'm going. And so it's not surprising to me that my fiction writing process is similar. Something that really surprised me about writing this book is that I can't talk too specifically about this because it gives something away, but there's a time jump at the end of the book that was not there until very, very late in the process. My dear friend Ed Park, a future guest of the Birchfield Penny Art Center and a wonderful novelist, everyone should read his book, Personal Days. Ed Park read what I thought was a pretty final draft of the manuscript. And he said, wait, you need to jump ahead in time. And so that part of the book I wrote very, very quickly. And there's a sort of energy and a clarity for me. I mean, readers might disagree, as we've established, the book doesn't belong to me anymore. But there's just this like, there's this very clear-headed energy in that section of the book, because I'd been given very clear marching orders by a dear friend who I trusted. And so I'm really grateful to Ed for giving that to me, because I now can't imagine the book without that jump ahead in time. So that was the most surprising part of the process for me.
Great. Anyone else that has any questions, please use the Q&A section.
And how do you find time to write with two small children and working full time?
Right now, I don't. Right now, I just don't. But I wrote this book. It took me 5 years to write it, from getting the initial idea to turning in the final manuscript. But at one point, perhaps this was a bit masochistic, but at one point I did an accounting of, every Saturday I hired a babysitter and worked on the book. Every morning I woke up at 4 and wrote for 2 furious hours. I tallied them all up into like 10-hour days. And I figured out that I wrote the book in 17 weeks, which is good, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
It was 17 weeks over
5 years.
5 years. So, that was just the reality of my older daughter was a tiny baby when I got the idea for the book. I had a baby in the middle of, starting it. So it was just the reality of juggling kids and a full-time job, and occasionally going to the grocery store and doing the things of life. But yeah, it's really hard to do. And at the moment I find it impossible. But I look forward to the day when I can start carving out that time again.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Joan again, because the thing that's so curious about her, we already established these are very complex characters. She, in one sense, is very, as you read, or in the right from the get-go, she sort of makes life hard for herself. She sets these false parameters for herself, and she keeps them, and believes that her life should be hard, and it's going to be hard. And in many ways, she does what her mother wants her to do. She does what her husband wants her to do, but yet she always does what she wants to do in the end. She really does have she is determined when she has something that she feels drawn to, like taking the school trip, like adopting the fourth child, that she's going to do it come hell or high water. And she doesn't in that moment need anyone's permission. She just needs to figure out how to make it happen, which I thought was so strange, because sometimes I think she's very weak, and other times I see that she really does have a backbone. Anyway, that's my assessment of her.
Again, I'm really happy to hear this because this was all intentional. I'm really, really happy to hear this. Yes, she is absolutely all of these contradictions. She is very dutiful, and she is in her own way incredibly rebellious. She is in some ways weak and passive, and in some ways her passivity is her strength. It becomes a form of passive aggression. She models herself.
It's a weapon.
Absolutely. And she's not as innocent as she seems. And I think that it's important to remember that she models her life after that of the saints. And many of the saints had these similar tensions and similar contradictions, where they were incredibly devout and dutiful and in the thrall of their God or their church. They were very obedient in some ways. And in other ways, they just did insane things. They just did completely insane things. I mean, Joan of Arc is a perfect example of this. She was a most obedient servant of her God, but she was also like, tearing into battle and saying crazy stuff that angered people in authority. And she embodied all those contradictions. And I think Jane is very conscious that as a suburban mother of three, she's never going to attain the glamour of a Teresa of Avila or a Catherine of Siena, but she's attracted to them. And they've been, literally handed to her on a missal in a pew in church as people that she should model herself after. And so she does. So that is really what I was going for. So I'm so pleased that you picked up on that.
We have a few more questions coming in from our participants. One asks, in the section you read, her mother asks her, "What's wrong with you?" And Jane smiled because she knew the answer. What do you think the answer was?
The answer is that Jane knows what is wrong with her, and what is wrong with her, Jane believes, is the same thing that was wrong with Catherine of Siena or Teresa of Avila or Joan of Arc. That she is a servant of Jesus Christ, with all of the loyalty to doctrine and to patriarchy that entails, and with all of the rebelliousness against the same social order that entails. That's what's wrong with her.
Marianne wants to know, do you already have ideas for your next book?
I do. Thank you for asking. I can't possibly talk about them because I will jinx myself, but I do. And I take surreptitious notes whenever I get the chance, but I won't be starting on it for a while.
And so with that, and I know how busy you are, this Mary wants to know, have you been writing a book over the last year?
Nope. Nope. I write to-do lists.
We all do that.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit more about your relationship with Buffalo, because it comes up often in the book. And I did not read your first book, so I'm wondering if those same references exist in that book as well. And as I said to you before we all got online, it seems like you've been here often, that you've kept up with all the locations of things in Buffalo.
Yeah, I mean, my parents still live in Buffalo. One of my brothers and my sister-in-law are in Buffalo, friends in Buffalo. Through this past year of the pandemic, I think one of the questions that I've heard the most from my kids who are 6 and 4 is, when are we going to Buffalo? Or when the virus is over, can we go to Buffalo to see BB and Pops? So, Buffalo is a place close to their heart. It's a paradise where their grandparents are, and the Botanic Garden and the zoo and just everything that they love. Wide open green spaces that they don't get as much in Brooklyn. So I love Buffalo, and my kids love Buffalo too. There's no Buffalo in my first book. My first book is very much a Brooklyn book. And yeah, I mean, in terms of feeling, helping the reader to feel like they're in Buffalo in the 70s and 80s and mostly the 90s. The book primarily takes place during the 1991 to 92 school year. I did take a couple of research trips, just driving around to various landmarks to see, if they stocked up to my memory. I spent a lot of time just in microfiche, just with the Buffalo News, which was so nice. I loved that. I loved researching the book. I loved just spending a lot of, hours and hours and hours with the Buffalo News, and kind of reconstructing parts of Buffalo's relatively recent history through those files. So yeah,
Buffalo's almost a character.
I think Buffalo is a character
Yeah.
in the book. Yeah, I was hoping that it would feel that way. No, I love doing research, but just getting deep into the newspaper archive was a real joy.
All right.
Pam would like to know with the details about Buffalo. She's asked, how do you remember all of the store names and details from the 90s?
How do I remember? I don't know. I mean, I just, when you're a teenager, there's certain memories that just crystallize in your head and they stay there forever. Like, browsing the racks at Home of the Hits, or the slightly musty smell of the secondhand boutiques on Elmwood Avenue, like Melange. Oh my God, I used to go to Melange all the time to see if they had, new fancy gloves or like a new tea dress from the 20s or something. I just remember, I have sense memories of like shopping experiences and social experiences that I had in Buffalo, at age 15, 16, 17, that are probably more acute and more concrete to me than, things that happened last week. And I think that's just a function of the age that I was, and the sponge I still was for, just soaking up experience and memory. So that was maybe easier than I would have expected.
So I'm going to I'm going to make a statement, and you can comment on how corny it is. Following the statement is, I was just thinking how Buffalo was very much a character in the book, and as complex and multi-layered as any of the characters in your book, because as a community, we took that whole spring of life and the whole the murder of doctors Slepian in very different ways. We saw it in very different ways. I don't think we were as polarized then as we are today, except on the question of abortion, which have always been very polarized on as a country and as a community as well. So just a thought.
The question is whether
Yeah,
that
I
we've
guess
become more polarized today, but we were always that polarized.
always on the question of abortion. And being a Catholic, it's always it becomes a even more complex issue. You're not, just like I'm sure it is for President Biden at this moment in time, as a devout Catholic himself, where is that balance? It is an ongoing conversation that many of my Catholic friends have. How do you balance it all? How do you balance a woman's right to choose, the birth of a baby or the death of a baby, however you view that? And I don't have an answer. I'm just musing over the question of it all and what a complex question it is without a resolve.
No, it is. I think it's a more complex question than maybe some people acknowledge. I think, for me, this was never a question that I grappled with personally. From the moment that I knew what an abortion was and I had any context for the question, I knew what I felt about it. And I was saying this before the conversation began, but I have a very acute memory of a sermon that was delivered at St. Gregory the Great during the Spring of Life that was very strongly anti-abortion. And, an older relative in my life, someone I respect greatly, took me aside after that and said, "Did you notice the woman who got up and left in protest during that sermon? And, it's okay to disagree." And that really stuck with me because I already knew what I thought by that point. I deeply respect that people struggle with this issue, that people who aren't anti-abortion extremists or the kinds of people who would storm the Capitol, that people who think about things in a nuanced and moral way grapple with abortion. I completely respect that. I don't think I could have written a book such as this one if I didn't have respect for how difficult it is. And I wanted to acknowledge the possibility of moral complexity in an abortion. I don't think that all abortions are morally complex. I think that most are not. I think for most women seeking abortions, they are seeking medical care. But I do think that people who are strongly pro-choice, I think it behooves them to acknowledge that there can be regret or sadness around an abortion, maybe not about the abortion itself, but about the circumstances that made it necessary. And I think this book allows for acknowledging the moral complexity of some choices in reproductive rights or reproductive justice. I think in this conversation, the word difficult or complex has come up a lot, and I really didn't want to shy away from anything that was difficult or complex in the book.
I think it was brave of you to you tackled it head on.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think it was very brave to do that. Do we have any other questions from our viewers out there?
Not right now, but if there are any more questions, please use that Q&A section.
Well, I do have a comment that I'll make while we're waiting to see if there are any further questions. And that is, and I said this to you earlier, Jessica, how exquisitely beautifully you described works of art. And I so appreciated those passages.
Thank you.
In fact, I looked them all up and looked at them on my computer while I was reading those passages. And so you could actually be a critic for in an art museum, and they're just so beautifully written. So I encourage everybody so many of our docents and our book club members love visual art, and I encourage you to by the book. Not, I mean, the book is wonderful, but I especially love those passages and enjoyed reading those.
Thank you. It's a real joy and possibly a slight indulgence to just stare at a work of art and describe what you see. I really enjoy doing that, and I hope that the pleasure that I took in that can be shared by the reader. I think another way that describing, maybe broadening the definition a little bit, that describing works of art or music videos or photographs, because that all of these things are described in the book. I think it's also helpful in terms of placing you in time. Jane looking at Caravaggio's in Rome isn't really placing you in time. It's just placing you in, oh, she's on a school trip to Rome.
She's in
But
Rome.
there are other times when, Lauren is listening to music as she falls asleep, or watching MTV. People do a lot of watching of MTV in this. It's not all high culture. Like there's definitely some MTV watching going on in the book. But it can place you in time. Like, this is what people were listening to. This is what people were thinking about or watching at this moment in 1991 or whatever it might be. And I also wanted to make sure that whenever I was describing a work of art in the book, that it was somehow, at least building a character, that you're looking at this work of art, but you're looking at it through a character's eyes, and you're starting to sense who they are and who they're becoming, and what's starting to catch their eye about the world around them by seeing the work of art through their eyes. And the best case scenario is that one of those can actually nudge the plot along a little bit. So I always wanted to make sure in those descriptions that there were parallel tracks or triple tracks happening. It's like, okay, we're going to enjoy this song or this work of art, but we're also nudging this character in a certain direction, or nudging the plot in a certain direction.
It just makes sense.
I hope so.
We have another question. So Gina is wondering, who exactly is the fourth child that Jane has?
There are several fourth childs in the book. Morella is the most obvious one. Morella is the child that Jane adopts from Romania. And actually, we haven't talked about that aspect of the book. Morella is from Romania. She spent the first few years of her life in a Romanian orphanage. And one of the big kind of cultural or news events that the book draws from is that in October of 1990, there was a 2020 episode that a lot of people watched and a lot of people remember, that exposed the orphanages in Romania. Under the Ceausescu regime, totalitarian regime, all abortion, but also all contraception was banned. So women in Romania completely lost any degree of reproductive autonomy. And the result of that was a spike in maternal mortality and hundreds of thousands of abandoned children who were abandoned to orphanages or institutions. And in the early 90s, this was exposed, and there were thousands of North American families who, many of them Christian, many of them in British Columbia, actually, but also in the States, who rushed to adopt these children and found that these children really had a lot of challenges because of the trauma and the deprivation that they had experienced early in their life. For Jane, I think she sees adopting Morella as a pledge of her pro-life credentials. She's choosing to show that she believes that love can conquer all. And so Morella is the fourth, she becomes the fourth child in Jane's family. Jane herself is also a fourth child. And there's a third fourth child in the book, but I think the reader should come to that one on their own.
Well, before we go, what else would you like us to know about your book?
Um, the Times Review, which I'm so grateful for, and thank you for sharing it, pointed this out. But I really try, as embarrassing as this is to say on my own behalf, the book is funny, or it tries to be. I really did try to make sure that there is some dark humor and some not so dark humor in the book. I really want the reader to feel, at least some of the time, entertained. I want the reader to feel free to laugh at some of the things that happen in the book, even though it goes to some pretty intense places. So if I'm advocating on behalf of the book, I guess that would be my last word on it.
There are some very funny parts to it too, especially the two brothers and
Thank
their
you, Mary.
antics are very funny.
Thank you for the backup.
Reminds me that I have two boys and a girl, so it does remind me of my boys and
Oh,
how
wow.
different they are from my daughter.
Okay.
So any other questions before we leave Jessica tonight? Congratulations on a really wonderful book and that great review you received this week.
Thank you, Mary,
I
and thank you, Michaela.
I encourage everyone to get the book and read it through. And I think there's another question.
Just
Michaela?
a thank you and congrats on the book.
Oh, thank you.
And I will welcome everybody back on, what's the date we're looking at?
April 1st.
April 1st. And the book is The Arthur Duncan Esquire, the third Esquire. And the name of the book is Attorney Felon, or Felon Attorney. I always get the two mixed up, but please join us again for our regular book club session. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Michaela, for your help. And Jessica, we applaud you. Don't forget to pick up her book at our local bookstores, independent bookstores in Buffalo. There's still many of them. And thank you all.
All right.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Have a
Good
good
night,
night.
everyone.